Claire Bennett had lived in the Montgomery estate for 5 years, quietly, like a shadow. She was the housekeeper and part-time nanny, responsible for cleaning, laundry, and occasionally watching over the children of visiting guests. Though she wasn't part of the family, she knew every corner of the house more intimately than its true owner. Claire's life was simple, a series of predictable routines. She woke up every day at 5:30 a.m., brewed coffee exactly how the master of the house liked it, wiped down every surface, every bookshelf, every pane of glass. She paid attention to the smallest details because Nathaniel Montgomery, the man she had secretly loved for 5 long years, missed nothing. Nathaniel, or Nate as most outsiders called him, wasn't the easiest man to approach. Cold, private, always distant. But Claire knew that behind the closed-off exterior was a soul weathered by experience, a man who had traded his youth for ambition and a relentless climb to the top. She had watched him return from meetings, his shoulders heavy, tie loosened, eyes dark with exhaustion, sipping scotch alone by the window overlooking the lake. He never spoke of his personal life, never asked about hers. But none of that stopped Claire from falling a little more each time he passed her with that faraway gaze and familiar scent. Some nights, when the entire mansion lay silent, Claire sat alone in her small basement room and imagined a different world. One where she and he were just ordinary people, no class divisions, no contracts, just 2 hearts beating quietly in sync. But she always reminded herself that world didn't exist. Nate was not the kind of man who noticed someone like her. He was often seen with glamorous women at parties, on elegant dates, and Claire would simply bow politely as they passed by. Even when her heart ached, she kept her professional smile firmly in place. She had never told a soul about her feelings, perhaps because she feared being laughed at, or because she knew too well. Her love for Nate had no place in the world they lived in. But deep down, Claire knew that if one day, by some miracle, he turned to look at her, truly look, she wouldn't be able to walk away. Late October cast a chill over Seattle. Mornings wrapped the lake in thick fog, turning the Montgomery estate into a still, somber painting. Claire went about her routine, laundry, dusting, brewing coffee, but something felt off that morning. Nathaniel hadn't come down for breakfast. Near noon, as she passed the library, she heard a faint sound like a glass tipping over. She pushed the door open, and her heart stopped. Nate was collapsed on the floor, one hand stretched toward the desk, his coffee cup shattered at his feet. She panicked and called for an ambulance. While waiting, she knelt beside him, clutching his hand, not as an employee, but as a woman who, for the first time in 5 years, was terrified of losing the man she secretly loved. The private hospital in downtown Seattle was quiet and discreet. Nate awoke after a few hours, waving off his assistant's offer to inform his family. He didn't want sympathy, didn't need empty reassurances. He needed answers. A series of tests followed. He expected the doctors to say it was stress, lack of rest, a minor deficiency, anything but the thing he feared in the back of his mind. But then came the truth. You have ALS, a rare, rapidly progressing form. You're looking at roughly 2 years. Nate said nothing. He sat there, frozen, as if his entire being unraveled at once. The doctor's words rang like funeral bells, slow and heavy. 2 years, not even a full election cycle. Not long enough to fall in love. Not long enough to live. He didn't return home. Instead, he drove for hours, aimlessly through Seattle's streets. The buildings blurred past. The lake, once his favorite retreat, felt like it belonged to someone else's life now. He thought of the company, the deals left unsigned, his parents, demanding perfection since childhood. He thought of himself, a boy who once dreamed of a family, but had grown into a man who buried all notions of love beneath ambition. Then he thought of the future, not his, but the Montgomery name. If I die, there will be no one to carry that name, no one to remember me beyond a headstone. The idea of having a child started as a faint glimmer, then crystallized, not to redeem his life, but to ensure it wouldn't vanish entirely, to leave behind blood, memory, breath. He didn't need a wife, not a hollow marriage for appearances. He needed someone steady, trustworthy, kind, someone to create life with him, even if love was never spoken. He thought of the women who had passed through his life, beautiful, sharp, successful. But none of them could walk this road quietly. None could carry this with grace. No one, except her. Claire's face came to him unbidden. She never demanded, never intruded, always appeared when needed, vanished when not. And most of all, she carried a stillness that, though he never admitted it, made him breathe easier whenever she was near. If there's anyone I can trust with the most important thing I'll ever do, it's her. Nate arrived home around 8 p.m. He didn't turn on the lights, just dropped his keys on the table, took off his coat, and walked straight into the living room. Everything in the mansion was exactly as it had always been, orderly, silent, immaculate. But tonight, it felt hollow. He poured himself a drink and sat down on the long sofa, facing the massive glass windows. Seattle was lit up outside. The night was beautiful, still, almost indifferent, much like how he felt now. He brought the glass to his lips, then paused. He stared out into the dark as if, by doing so long enough, he might find some kind of answer to everything left unnamed. It wasn't death that scared him. It was the haunting thought that perhaps, all this time, he hadn't truly lived. All the meetings, the deals, the praise, scripted, predictable, and absent of any trace of the heart. He set the glass down, rubbed his eyes. No tears, but a weariness that reached all the way to the bone. There was no more time to hesitate, no more time to fix things the old way. And then, he thought of Claire. He didn't know why. She was not the kind of woman who demanded attention. She never tried to charm, never tried to be noticed. But somehow she always made things feel still. And in the chaos of everything falling apart, that stillness became the only thing that felt real. He rose, walked slowly to the house phone, hesitated, then dialed her room. "Claire, I'm sorry to call this late, but if you're free, could you come to my room? I need to talk." There was a pause, then her gentle reply, "Yes, sir." Claire's heart raced as she stood outside his door. In 5 years, he had never called for her like this, especially not at night. When she entered, he was seated by the fireplace, sleeves rolled, tie loose. He looked up and, for the first time, didn't nod coldly, but said quietly, "Please, sit." She did so carefully, hands folded. The room was thick with unspoken weight. Nate stood near the window, back to her. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "How long have you worked here, Claire?" "Almost 5 years, sir." "And have I ever made you uncomfortable?" The question surprised her. "No, Mr. Montgomery, never." He nodded, still not facing her. "Today, I collapsed in the library. You called for help. I appreciate that." Claire blushed faintly. It was nothing. Anyone would have done the same. He turned to face her. His expression was not one of a boss, but a man on the edge of asking the impossible. "I've been diagnosed with ALS," he said slowly. "Fast progressing. They gave me 2 years. Claire froze. Her hands trembled. "I'm not saying this for sympathy," he added. "I'm just trying to find something meaningful to leave behind." He took a step closer. His voice cracked, just slightly. "Claire, I want to have a child." Her breath caught. "I know this is unimaginable. I'm not looking for love, not for a relationship. But if there's one person I trust to raise my child with kindness and strength, it's you." Claire stared at him, speechless. "Mr. Montgomery," she whispered. He raised a hand gently. "You don't have to decide now. I would ensure your independence. A home, full custody. I only ask you to consider it. And if you say yes, I'd prefer it be natural, not in a lab, but like two people, giving something sacred to one another." Claire breathing hard. His words echoed, not because they shocked her, but because for the first time she felt truly seen. "Why me?" she whispered. Nate sat across from her, no longer a boss, just a man asking for something fragile. "Because you never asked anything of me, because you made others feel safe, even in silence, and because I know my child would be loved if it were with you." Claire looked up, no tears, but her heart had already shifted. Claire stayed quiet for a long moment. Her eyes rested on the flickering fire. Then she spoke softly. "Mr. Montgomery, I need time to think. This is something far too big for me to answer right away." Claire couldn't sleep that night. She lay on the single bed in her small basement room, the quiet world that had been hers for 5 years. But tonight, the walls felt tighter, the silence echoing louder inside her chest. Nate's words kept replaying in her mind. "I don't have time. I need something to outlive me, and I want you to help me create it." It wasn't a love confession. It wasn't a dream. It was a request, direct, almost brutal in its clarity. No flowers, no promises, just trust. And yet her heart ached as if it had been broken. She thought about her own life, about growing up without a father, about her mother fighting silently to raise her alone. Claire had never been someone people chose first. She was always the one in the background, the one people passed over. And now, the man she had loved quietly for 5 years, always too far to reach, was asking her for the most intimate gift. Not love, but life. "He doesn't love me," she thought, "but he trusts me. And in his world, that kind of trust is sacred." She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't some fairy tale. If she said yes, she'd step into a chapter she couldn't erase. One day, when the child asked, "Who was my father?" she would tell the story of a man who didn't stay, but who once looked at her, just once, and chose her to carry part of his soul. At 4 a.m., she got out of bed and walked quietly upstairs. She didn't need a light. She knew every stair, every creak in the floorboards. The soft glow from the fireplace lit the room where Nate still sat, sleepless. He looked up as she entered, the fatigue in his eyes softening into something else, something that looked like hope. "Claire," he said gently, "you don't have to decide right now." She sat beside him, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'm not saying yes for the money," she said. "Not for the house, not for the support. I'm saying yes because I've always wanted to give you something from my heart, even if you never knew it." He didn't speak. His hand gripped the edge of the blanket slightly tighter, as if to hold something in. "And if the last thing you want in this life is a child," she continued, "then I'll be the one to bring it into the world for you. Not for title, not for obligation, but because I believe you'll be a father, even if only for a short time." Silence settled again, but this time it was warm, not empty. "Thank you," he said softly. "I won't forget this." Claire smiled, not the polite smile of a housekeeper, but the gentle, knowing smile of someone stepping into a future she never dared to imagine and no longer feared. Nate didn't want their first time to happen in the mansion where she had lived like a shadow for the past 5 years. He wanted to create a different space, one where there were no masters and servants, no memories of work, no roles to play, just him and her as two real people. That evening, he drove Claire to a small seaside apartment on the west side of Seattle, a private, quiet place with a balcony overlooking the ocean. The apartment was small but refined, decorated in neutral tones, simple yet cozy. Claire entered, her eyes wide with surprise. "It's beautiful," she whispered softly. Nate smiled, removed his jacket, and poured 2 glasses of red wine. He handed her one, then gestured for her to sit on the couch by the window. "Do you come to the beach often?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Claire shook her head. "I've never left the city for more than a night since my mother passed. I've been working nonstop. No time for things like the beach." He nodded, understanding. "I was the same. I used to hate the beach, because my father would drag me fishing every summer, even though I just wanted to stay home and read." She laughed. "I used to want to be an art teacher." He tilted his head, intrigued. "Really? Do you paint?" "Yes," she nodded. "But I couldn't afford college, so I started working early. Housekeeping was my first job. And in the end, I chose to stay, because it was where you were." The last part she whispered, almost like a half-confession, but Nate heard it. He didn't answer immediately, just quietly clinked his glass against hers, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you for staying," he said. They talked for hours, about their childhoods, about things they had never shared with anyone. Claire talked about the winter nights when her mother would fold warm towels and place them by the stove so she wouldn't be cold on her way to school. Nate talked about the old piano he used to play alone whenever he felt too small in the vastness of the house. They laughed, not out of politeness, but because they realized that, after all, they had both been lonely in the same way. The first kiss came when she lowered her head to laugh at a silly story he had told. Nate gently brushed his hand against her cheek, his fingers lightly pushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Claire looked up at him. The look in her eyes was enough to erase all the distance between their hearts. He leaned down, slowly, and kissed her. The kiss was gentle, unfamiliar, yet warm, as though they had been waiting for it for a long time. They didn't speak anymore. She set her wine glass down on the table, then gently squeezed his hand. He understood. Every movement after that was slow, respectful, not because of the physical act, but because of the emotions. They touched each other as if searching for something sacred, something that had never been named. When he held her in his arms and whispered her name into his breath, Claire tilted her head, placing her lips close to his ear, and whispered, trembling, "I've loved you for 5 years." Nate froze for a moment. It wasn't to elicit a response of love. It was simply a truth that had been held back for far too long. He held her tighter. He said nothing, but his hands, how he kissed her, how he held her afterwards, was the answer. The next morning, Claire woke up to the soft morning light streaming through the curtains. She was still in Nate's arms, her head resting on his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the ocean waves gently lapped against the shore. She opened her eyes and gazed at the sky, a calm blue that stretched endlessly beyond the window. For the first time in her life, Claire didn't feel like she was standing on the sidelines. She wasn't the one serving a family that didn't belong to her. She wasn't the woman hidden behind the back door. She was Claire, a woman who had given away the truest thing in her heart and was now being held by the only person she had ever loved. 3 weeks after that night in the seaside apartment, Claire began to feel different. At first, it was just a slight fatigue. She thought it was from overwork. Then one morning, the smell of coffee made her nauseous. Another afternoon, while washing glasses, she suddenly grew so dizzy she had to sit down on the kitchen floor. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but somewhere deep in her heart, something instinctual already knew the answer. That afternoon, while Nate was still at the office, Claire quietly went to a nearby clinic. She didn't explain much, only asked for a test. She waited alone, wrapped in her faded coat, fingers intertwined tightly in her lap. And when the nurse walked in with a smile and said, "Congratulations, it's positive," Claire didn't speak. She simply smiled, softly, gently, as if what she'd just heard wasn't a shock at all, but something that had been growing quietly inside her for a long time. That night she came home early. Dinner was neatly laid out on the table, the scent of food warming the kitchen. But instead of retreating to her room after the meal, Claire stayed by the entryway, eyes fixed on the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Nate walked in, looking tired after a long day. He paused, surprised to see her still awake, standing there in the soft golden light. "You waited for me?" he asked, removing his coat, his eyes studying her closely. Claire nodded. Her eyes were bright, carrying something that made him stop in place. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked quietly, but clearly. He nodded and led her into the library. They sat down like they always did, but this time her heartbeat was pounding. Claire placed a hand gently on her belly, an unconscious, instinctive gesture of protection. "I'm pregnant," she said softly, eyes never leaving his. No hesitation, no pretense. Nate froze for a moment, staring at her as though trying to process each word, each breath. "Really?" he whispered. She nodded, smiling, a warm, subtle smile that filled the room with a strange peace. He leaned back in the chair, fingers interlocked, silent. But it wasn't confusion. It was something deeper, something that shook the core of him. After a long pause, he stood, walked toward her, and sat down beside her. He didn't touch her, just sat close, as if afraid this fragile moment would disappear if he moved too quickly. "How do you feel?" he finally asked. "I feel full and not afraid," she replied gently. "For the first time in my life, I don't feel lost." Nate looked at her for a long while, then reached out and placed his hand gently over hers. His hand trembled slightly, but it was warm, steady. "Thank you," he said softly, "for trusting me, for bringing this life into the world." In the days that followed, everything changed, quietly but unmistakably. Nate became different, not because he had to, but because something inside him had shifted. He quietly adjusted her meals, replacing coffee with ginger tea, rushed breakfasts with soft-boiled eggs and fruit. Every morning he was the first to wake up, preparing tea, arranging breakfast, and watching her eat across from him, as if seeing her well was enough to start his day. Claire still helped around the house, but Nate no longer called her Miss Claire. He said her name, softly, naturally, as though her name had finally found its place in his world. He took her to every prenatal appointment. In the waiting room, he held her hand, his thumb gently stroking hers. When they first heard the baby's heartbeat, Claire turned to find Nate's eyes slightly red. She didn't say a word, just rested her head against his shoulder, feeling safe. At night, he stopped locking himself away in work. He read next to her, sometimes in silence, just flipping pages together like they were learning to exist side by side in quiet harmony. He noticed every little thing, always placing a pillow behind her back when she sat, resting his hand over her belly each night like a silent hello to their child, keeping his phone on him at all times, just in case you need to call, even at midnight. One foggy morning, Claire stood at the window, hand gently resting on her belly. The ocean waves whispered outside. Her bump hadn't yet started to show, but within, life was growing every day. Nate came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her. His hands rested gently across her waist, his chin on her shoulder. She leaned back into him, safe, steady, whole. "Do you ever think," he began, voice soft, "that maybe someday we could be a family?" Claire smiled. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a plan. It was a hope. For the first time, one they both dared to dream of. And maybe, just maybe, believe in. Ever since Claire found out she was pregnant, everything in the house began to shift. Not loudly, not abruptly, but through subtle movements, gentle rhythms. Like a quiet melody, only those living it could hear. Nate started waking up earlier. He no longer rushed straight into his office after breakfast. Instead, he spent 10 quiet minutes each morning asking her simple things. Did you sleep well? Are you feeling tired? Can you keep anything down? Just 3 questions, repeated daily. Yet to Claire, they were like delicate threads stitching her spirit back together, one that had been torn by years of loneliness. She began to get used to his presence, not as a distant master of the house, but as a man slowly learning how to care. Every time she bent down to tie her shoelaces, he would gently intervene. Let me do it. Don't bend too low. It might affect the baby. That one sentence warmed her more than any expensive gift ever could. One late autumn afternoon, they went to the grocery store together. Not as employer and employee, just 2 people, walking down the aisles, sharing a cart, laughing over whether to get almond milk or oat milk. Claire couldn't remember the last time she'd gone grocery shopping with anyone. But this time, she knew she'd remember it forever, especially the moment Nate sneakily tossed a tub of vanilla ice cream into the cart and winked. For when your midnight sweet cravings hit. On the drive back, he didn't turn on the music. The window was slightly cracked, letting in the ocean breeze. Her hand rested on her belly. His hand covered hers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. One night, Claire had a leg cramp. She tried not to wake him, but her soft groan stirred him instantly. Nate rushed into her room without hesitation, sat on the edge of her bed, and gently massaged her leg. You should have called me right away, he murmured, his voice a mix of concern and gentle scolding. Claire looked up, her eyes watery. I didn't want to bother you. He looked straight at her, firm but tender. You never bother me. In that moment she realized his feelings weren't born from pity or obligation. They were something else, something that, like the life growing inside her, was slowly taking shape. Still, neither of them spoke it out loud. They maintained a respectful distance, carefully avoiding words too risky to name. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps because neither had ever dared to believe before. But feelings? They don't wait for permission. They grow, like green shoots pushing through cracks in stone. Quiet, steady, without a name. One cold evening, Nate came home late. Claire was curled up in the library, reading, her legs tucked under a small footstool, a thin blanket wrapped around her. He stepped in and paused for a moment, just watching her under the soft golden light. Then he quietly grabbed another blanket, sat down beside her, and gently pulled her closer. Are you cold? He asked. She shook her head. But when he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, she leaned into him, whispering, I used to be comfortable with loneliness, but now I don't want to get used to it again. He didn't answer. He simply kissed the top of her head, for the first time, not out of duty, not out of instinct, but because his heart no longer had space for silence. The next morning, when she woke up, she found a small note on the kitchen table in his familiar handwriting. I have an early meeting today. Don't forget your orange juice. And if you're craving blueberry muffins, I've left some in the oven. Nate, and the little one inside you too. Claire read the note and laughed. A soft, full, glowing laugh. Like a morning that didn't need sunlight to feel bright. She didn't know what the future would hold. Didn't know what to call what they were to each other, or where it would all lead. But now each day felt like something worth waiting for. No longer a repetition of chores and silence. Now, Claire knew, she was no longer alone. And perhaps, neither was he. In the 9th month of her pregnancy, Claire was just days away from her due date. Nate, the man who had once lived by cold logic, had now become obsessively careful. He hired a private midwife, prepared everything, a fully equipped birthing room inside the villa, an ambulance on standby, and even learned to count her every breath each night. Every evening before bed, He would place his hand gently on her belly, whispering under the soft glow of the lamp, "Our baby is almost here, Claire." His eyes lit up like someone discovering hope for the first time. But fate never follows a plan. That morning, while Claire was making tea in the kitchen, a loud crash made her spin around. In front of the library door, Nate was lying motionless on the floor, blood seeping from his forehead, his eyes shut, no final words. "Nate!" Claire screamed, rushing to him. But as her hand touched his cold face, a sharp pain tore through her abdomen. She clutched her belly and collapsed, her water breaking, streaming across the marble floor. A wave of double panic flooded the villa. The housekeeper frantically called 2 ambulances, one for the man slipping into a coma, and one for the woman going into labor, terrified and alone. Within 10 minutes, both were taken away, in separate directions. No hands held, no words exchanged. Only the sound of ambulance sirens slicing through the air. Claire gave birth alone. No Nate, no familiar faces. Only the beeping of monitors and nurses with hurried eyes. The physical pain merged with panic and grief until she nearly lost consciousness. But when her baby girl let out her first cry, Claire broke into tears, not from happiness, but from a crushing emptiness. Nate wasn't there, and she didn't know if he was still alive or already gone forever. After giving birth, Claire was so weak she couldn't even stand on her own. And yet, just 2 days later, before she'd had any chance to recover, she was brought back to the Montgomery estate without a single word of explanation. They said, "The master has requested that you be cared for at the private residence." Holding her baby tightly, Claire's heart was in turmoil. She believed it. She thought Nate had woken up, that he wanted to see their child, see her. She stepped into the grand mansion with a fragile thread of hope, not knowing that true darkness was waiting for her inside. In the vast living room, Nate's mother, Rose Montgomery, was already standing, waiting. Dressed in black, with silk gloves on her hands, she looked like a walking verdict. Claire hadn't even opened her mouth before the woman spoke. "Put the child down. We'll have someone take care of it." Claire clutched her baby tighter, confusion and fear twisting inside her. Her voice was cold as stone. "So, you got what you wanted, didn't you?" Claire held her baby tighter, confused, her vision blurred with exhaustion, but the contempt in that voice jolted her wide awake. "You think I don't see right through you?" Rose continued, stepping closer with every word. "A maid seducing my son behind our backs, then using a pregnancy to trap him. I've seen your kind before, gold diggers, cheap, shameless." Claire pressed her lips together, her arms wrapped tightly around the infant. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't answer. She had just given birth. Her body still ached, but no physical pain could compare to the wounds those words carved into her. Rose glanced at the newborn, then turned away with visible disgust. "This child will be raised properly in the Montgomery family. As for you, get out of my son's life. Now." Claire gasped softly. I didn't do anything wrong. I love him." "Love?" Rose gave a bitter laugh. "Your idea of love was climbing into bed with a man you knew was heir to an empire? You think a swollen belly gives you a place in this family?" She turned to the staff. "Take the child and prepare the car. She won't spend another minute under this roof." Claire staggered to her feet, clutching her baby. "Please, don't. Let me see Nate. Just once. Please." But Rose had already turned away. With a flick of her hand, 2 men approached. Without mercy, they tore the infant from Claire's arms. She screamed, "Don't take my baby, please." Rose turned back one last time, her eyes like sharpened knives. "You are not worthy of the Montgomery name, and you will never see my son again." Then, with her own hands, she dragged Claire from the room, opened the door, and pushed her out. Claire collapsed on the cold floor, her palms scraping the marble as she reached out in desperation. "Let me see Nate. Please." But the door slammed shut, hard, final, merciless. And just like that, alone, fragile, barely a day after giving birth, Claire was thrown out of the place that once felt like home. No child, no lover, not even a goodbye. She stumbled away from the estate. No coat, no shoes, just a bleeding woman, trembling in pain, her pants soaked in postpartum blood. She wandered the streets with no destination. Her body was failing, her arms empty, her world shattered. Every light she passed seemed too bright, every face too indifferent. No one knew that she had just lost everything. She sat alone on a cold bench in the park, her coat clutched around her frail frame. The moon hung low, and her breath came in short, shallow bursts. Not a mother, not a lover, not even a person worth listening to. And what broke her most was not the cruelty. It was the thought that Nate might wake up and never know she had been taken from him. She whispered into the night like a prayer, "Nate, if you're still there, please find me." Then she closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to disappear. Out on the damp city street, every step was a sob caught in her throat. She didn't know where to go, didn't know what was left. All she knew was this: that woman had taken everything from her, and Nate might never know. That night, drawn by something she couldn't explain, Claire returned to the seaside apartment, the place where they had first belonged to each other. Once lit by candlelight and hope, it now stood dark and cold. She didn't go inside. Instead, she sat alone on the sand, curled up against the sea breeze, arms wrapped around her frail body, eyes blank as she stared out at the black water, endless like an abyss. 2 days later, Nate woke up. His head was heavy, his vision blurry, but one thought cut through everything like lightning. "Where's Claire?" he whispered, trying to sit up. The nurse hesitated. "She's no longer here." "What do you mean?" Nate's voice cracked. "Did she go home? Was she discharged?" The nurse looked away. "All I know is that she was taken back to the estate, but she left soon after." Something inside Nate shattered. "She wouldn't leave, not without telling me. Not after everything," he muttered, almost to himself. And then the silence became unbearable. He ripped the IV from his arm. His feet hit the cold floor. The nurses rushed in, shouting, but he didn't care. "I have to find her," he growled. "I have to find Claire." Like a man possessed, he pushed past them, barely dressed, barely breathing, but more alive than he had ever felt. He didn't know where she was, only that he had to bring her home. He searched like a madman, from the hospital to every place they'd ever been. Then suddenly, he remembered the place where it all began, the place where her eyes first made their way into his heart, the seaside apartment. By the time he arrived, the sun had just slipped below the horizon. The beach lay dim in the pale gray light. And there, a small figure sat motionless, hunched, hair disheveled, thin shoulders trembling. "Claire," he called out, his voice like wind breaking. She didn't turn right away. It took a few seconds before she slowly lifted her head, and when her eyes met his, her pale lips released only one sound: a choked sob. Nate rushed to her, dropping to his knees, wrapping his arms around her as if afraid she might vanish. He didn't ask where she had gone, didn't ask why. He only said, "I'm sorry, please don't leave me again." Claire broke down, collapsing into his arms like the final wave crashing after days of silent restraint. The next morning, he brought her back to the mansion. The entire Montgomery family stood there. His mother, his brother, their lawyer, eyes sharp and cold like a wall of knives. But this time, Nate didn't back down. He held Claire's hand tightly and faced them head on. "This is the woman I love, the mother of my daughter. From this day forward, anyone who can't accept her doesn't need a place in my life." No one spoke. Claire stood there, no longer the girl forced to leave the hospital in shame and pain, but a woman who had been chosen, openly, proudly. Nate leaned down, pressed his lips to her forehead. "I'm sorry for not protecting you sooner." And Claire, after everything, smiled. Small, fragile, but enough to soften the entire room. Because now she was no longer an outsider. She no longer walked alone through the night wind, and the man who belonged to her heart had finally chosen her, for no reason other than love. 3 months later, spring quietly returned to the shores of Washington. In the seaside villa, morning sunlight streamed through the large glass windows, spilling onto the soft carpet where a tiny baby slept peacefully in a white lace-trimmed cradle. Her name was Lily, a name Claire had always kept in her heart like a simple dream, long before she ever knew she would become a mother. Lily had Nate's clear, bright eyes and the same slight furrow in her brow as Claire when she slept. Small, serene, and radiant like a miracle, arriving after the storm to heal the pain of two people who once believed they didn't deserve to be loved. Now, Claire was no longer a maid. She no longer lived in the basement, no longer hid behind doors. She was a part of this home. She was Lily's mother. She was the woman Nate loved, openly, without fear of the outside world's judgment. Every morning, Nate was the first to wake, gently lifting his daughter from her cradle and whispering nonsense words filled with love. "Good morning, Daddy's little princess." Claire would often watch from the doorway, her heart quietly overflowing with gratitude. And whenever Lily cried in the middle of the night, Claire was no longer alone. Nate was always the first to rise, holding their daughter, making a bottle, comforting her with his husky, awkward lullabies. But Lily always calmed, as if she could sense how tender her father's heart truly was. The Montgomery family, in the end, chose silence. They offered no apology and no longer interfered. Nate's mother, the woman who once thought she could control everything with power, finally understood that nothing could force her son's heart to give up what it truly wanted. And Nate never looked back. He chose Claire. He chose Lily. He chose love, not perfect, but real, resilient, and unconditional. One weekend afternoon, the three of them returned to the old beachfront apartment, the place that had witnessed their first kiss, their first night together, and the quiet confession carried like a breeze. "I've loved you for 5 years." Claire held Lily in her arms, while Nate carried a picnic basket. The waves lapped gently. The sky was as clear as it had been that day. "Do you remember the first time I came here?" Claire asked, a gentle smile lighting her eyes. Nate nodded. "You wore a pale blue dress, and I couldn't take my eyes off you." They sat down beside each other, shoulders touching. Lily slept soundly in her mother's arms, her tiny lips pursed as if dreaming something sweet. There was no need for a grand wedding, no vows of eternity. All they needed was the three of them. A family. Nate gently squeezed Claire's hand, his warm voice rising between the sound of the waves. "I used to think my life would end in silence, but then you came and turned the ending into the most beautiful part." Claire smiled, eyes brimming with tears. "And I used to think I'd always be a shadow in someone else's life, but you saw me, and you chose me." They said nothing more, not because there was nothing to say, but because no more words were needed. Beneath the blue sky, with the ocean's song and hearts beating strong in their chests, a new chapter of their lives began. No more distance, no more fear, only love, whole, honest, and full of hope. And a little girl named Lily, the miracle they once never dared to dream. The time after Lily's birth was one of the rarest seasons of their lives, when happiness felt whole, real, and within reach. But like a quiet shadow returning to claim its place, Nate's illness began to creep back in. The disease he once thought had retreated came back quietly, stealing his strength little by little. Chest pains, shortness of breath, sleepless nights, constant fatigue. He tried to hide it from Claire at first, wanting to shield her from worry. But she knew. She always knew. She saw it in the way he gripped her hand tighter for no reason, in the way he held Lily a little longer each night. One afternoon, as Claire held Lily near the window, Nate walked over slowly, every step a quiet effort. "I think I should write some things down," he said gently. "Write what?" Claire asked, eyes already brimming. "Things Lily should know, in case I'm not here someday, about how much I love the two of you." Claire cried, but she didn't stop him. She just took his hand, firm and tender, like the way he once held hers when their story was just beginning. From that day forward, time slowed. Every moment became sacred. Claire cared for Nate with a devotion so quiet, it felt like prayer. She cooked light meals, made fresh orange juice every morning, helped him out to the porch so he could breathe the ocean air. When he was too weak, she just sat beside him, holding his hand, saying nothing, letting him know she was still there. And Lily grew, like a flicker of sunlight darting through a house, slowly being embraced by shadows. Nate smiled every time she laughed. When he held her, his eyes would shine with something sacred, as if trying to etch every moment deep into his soul, for the very last time. Then, one soft June evening, the sky turned a pale shade of orange. The sea was still, the air calm. Claire helped Nate out to the porch, to the wooden bench where they often sat to watch the sunset. He rested his head on her shoulder. She wrapped her arm around him, gentle but sure. They said nothing. They didn't need to. "Thank you for making the end of my life the most beautiful part," Nate whispered. Claire gripped his hand tighter, their fingers interlocked. "I'm here," she said, voice cracking. Inside, Lily slept. Outside, the world was still, peaceful. Nate closed his eyes, drew in one deep breath, then another, shallower. And then, nothing. Claire felt her shoulder grow wet. A single tear. She turned her head and knew. He was gone. He had slipped away in silence, on the shoulder of the woman he loved most. Beneath the sunset, he once said looked like the color of your eyes. Claire didn't scream, didn't sob. She sat still for a long, long time, holding him like she was trying to hold back the moment from dissolving into memory. His last tear remained on her shoulder, like a farewell, soft, but forever. She stayed there until the stars came out, until the breeze grew cold and the sea grew dark. She didn't move, not because she couldn't, but because a part of her refused to let go. Later that night, after the nurses came and took his body, Claire returned inside and sat on the edge of the bed they had once shared. She looked down at the shirt still damp with his final tear and whispered, almost too soft to hear, "Thank you for seeing me, for loving me in your way." From then on, every sunset became sacred, not because they were beautiful, but because she knew, somewhere in that orange light, he was still with her. Years later, when Lily would sit by the window and ask, "Mom, what was my dad like?" Claire would smile, but her eyes would still carry sadness. "Your dad was the last sunlight of my life, and you are the reason I still rise each morning, even though my heart broke long ago."